I'm Stephen Fee for PBS NewsHour Weekend, and for the last 2 months we've been reporting on some safety issues pertaining to transporting oil by rail, particularly after the big spike of oil production in places here in the U.S. like North Dakota. We're having a big piece on the broadcast, but for now I'm joined by Russell Gold. He is the senior energy reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He's also author of The Boom: How Fracking Ignited the American Energy Revolution and Changed the World. Russell, thanks a bunch for doing this with us.
No, thank you for having me, Stephen.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So maybe you can just start with, how did we get here? Why is it that, usually when we're talking about oil transfers around the country, it's going by pipeline? Why is all this oil from North Dakota going on trains?
It's actually pretty simple. A couple of years ago, up in North Dakota, North Dakota was producing 150,000 barrels a day of oil, and there was plenty of pipeline infrastructure for that. It's now knocking on the door of 1 million barrels a day. I mean, it's gone up by 850,000 barrels a day. That's more than 2 OPEC countries right now. And it happened so quickly in just a few years that there was no time to build pipelines. Much less, it's really difficult to build pipelines in this country right now. So the industry is looking around and sort of trying to figure out, well, how do we get this oil out? We don't want to slow down. And they struck upon trains.
So, Russell, what are some of the big concerns? We saw a huge derailment in Castleton, North Dakota at the end of the year. That's the focus of our broadcast piece. But just last week, a train derailed in the middle of Lynchburg, Virginia, that was carrying crude oil. What are the dangers that we're talking about here?
Well, the main danger is that when these trains are derailing, the fireballs, the explosions are just incredible, because Bakken crude is not a typical really dead crude, which can burn but doesn't explode. It is incredibly combustible and flammable. And that's, as we reported in the Wall Street Journal, that's because Bakken crude has a lot of entrained gases in it, gases that cause it to explode. I mean, you talk about Castleton, North Dakota. The pictures from Castleton are unbelievable. And these are 10, 12-story tall fireballs going up. It's not what you expect from crude. So that's the biggest danger. But the other big danger really is that you talk to fire departments, you talk to emergency responders, they're set up to deal with a few thousand gallons of gasoline spilling from a truck or something like that on the highway. What the industry is doing are running these unit trains, each 100 to 120 tankers in a row, and each of these has, what, 30,000 gallons. There's an incredibly large amount of fuel, much more than they've seen in the past.
Yeah. Well, and I want to bring up an image here if I can. Part of this story has been about, okay, maybe it's something with the rail cars. Maybe they need to be stronger. So right now I'm trying to bring up an image of how the rail industry says, look, these are the types of cars that we advocate for, and that government regulation is behind. And as we report in our piece, part of the issue is that the NTSB has been warning about unsafe cars for a very long time, but it's only recently that we've really begun the regulatory process to change this. Why is it taking so long?
Well, there was a lot of discussion and the industry working with the government to try to sort of come up with a collaborative regulation a few years ago and come up with this new standard, and it's just taken several years to sort of go through this process, and now you have these new rules. Basically, this happened. The oil boom and the increasing use of trains to move crude happened so quickly that the government bureaucracy and regulations have just not caught up. And that's not just purely the government's fault. I mean, they were working collaboratively with the industry, which wasn't exactly moving that quickly either. The best that we can tell, right now, the fleet of tanker cars, there are maybe 97,000 tanker cars in North America that can move this. More than 2/3 of them, about 68%, are these older legacy cars which need upgrades and hardening and new shields, and only about 1/3 of them are the newer, safer cars.
Right, and of course there's concerns about, if you instantly bring all these cars off the rails, that could impede oil delivery in the country. At least that's what the industry says. Is that what you're hearing too?
I don't think, yes, that's clearly what the industry is saying, but I think they're absolutely right in this case. If you were to take 68% of the railroad fleet that's used to carry this and just simply say, no, they have to be retrofitted, they can't be used, not just would you would slow down the entire energy boom in the United States.
Right.
So, there's no question about that, but maybe it's something that needs to happen. And so what the Department of Transportation is left with, and they did this week, is that they put out this voluntary order which basically said do it as quickly as you can. And so they're trying to use whatever sort of moral suasion they have to get these upgrades happening quickly, because my sense is they're not willing, or maybe they can't come out and say you cannot use these tanker cars anymore. I mean, there'd be huge economic ramifications, and if you thought Keystone was a political fight, just wait until they try to do that.
Yeah, and you mentioned this advisory this week recommending not using these tankers. You've been reporting on this for a long time. Do you think this presages the rulemaking that we might see come out of Washington on this, that they're saying, look, we're going to eventually take these cars off the rails, you better get ready?
Oh, they've been telegraphing that for several months. There's no question about that. The old DOT 111 cars, they are going to need to be upgraded, whether the industry does it, whether railroads basically saying we're facing too much liability, or government. It's not a question of if this happens, it's a question of when and how quickly.
Well, let me ask you that question. In your perspective, how quickly could something like this happen?
Well, from what we're hearing, it's going to take some time. There just simply aren't the yards, the railroad depots to do it. But then again, the oil industry is incredibly wealthy. It has a lot of billions of dollars of free cash. If you say this needs to be done, they have the money to build the new facilities to draw this in. So it can happen. You're probably talking years, not months, but it can happen fairly quickly, turn around. And what the government's trying to do is get this process sped up right now. Speed it up.
Well, you've been covering the boom, of course, more broadly in North Dakota. Our numbers are showing that there's going to be even more oil production in the state. They're not even at capacity yet. Is rail here to stay? Is this really how oil is going to be moving from now on?
Yeah, Stephen, that's a great question. A few years ago, when we started seeing rail, everyone said, "Oh, well, we always move by pipelines. Why, rail's is a temporary fix." It's looking more and more like rail's a permanent fix. You have pipeline companies like Plains All American and Kinder who are getting into the rail business, buying cars, buying depots. There are certain advantages to being able to move crude on rail, and those advantages really are that you can take it where it's needed. You can take it to the refineries on the coast, because you have to imagine we have built our refinery system on the coast because we're so used to bringing in crude on ships from overseas. And so we're sort of faced now where we have this huge oil boom in the middle of the country, and getting it to the coast is really difficult. It's not just a matter of building pipelines in North Dakota, it's building new pipelines into Philadelphia and into Seattle, Washington, into New Jersey. It's really difficult to happen. And so railroads are really using this this incredibly disruptive change, both in terms of the volume of crude, but also the location, and they're using it to take advantage because the pipeline just simply can't keep up. My sense is we're probably, when we have this conversation again in 10 years, pipelines will have taken back over. But until then, I mean, this is a multiple-year situation where we have crude moving through communities all across the country.
Great. Well, thanks, Russell Gold of the Wall Street Journal. The book is called The Boom: How Fracking Ignited the American Energy Revolution and Changed the World. Thanks a bunch for doing this with us. We appreciate it.